I started to do psychology because we had at that time, I think, at secondary schools, it was not anything like a topic. It was entirely new. And then I read some books in retrospect, not too good books about psychology, and I sort of had a belief in the mechanics of the soul or something like that. And I really sort of, was curious about that. And then when I studied psychology, it's still at the Free University in Amsterdam where I was. It had a sort of German phenomenological and to some extent psychoanalytic flavor. And then I think during my second year, third year, we had a few people coming back from the United States where they had studied, done a PhD. And they came back with a totally new psychology, and that was far more appealing. It was far more like this natural science approach, which I'd always liked also at secondary school. And at the end of my studies, my then professor, Sipke Fokkema, who was I think fairly great friend of Biesheuvel, and mentioned that there was some bursary available, and I must say he helped me applying for it. In the end, I got this fellowship, which was donated by the Anglo-American company, and then came out to South Africa.
What was the nature of psychology during those years?
Well, I don't think it was too much different from the Netherlands at the time. I mean, there were also here people with a phenomenological orientation, and of course tests, the psychotechnics was rather well developed here, and I think similar as what you would find in the Netherlands at the time. And there were also some more American-oriented, behaviorist-oriented psychologists, particularly at Witwatersrand University at the time, and so it was quite a mixture, actually, in orientation. And I think that later on, people have even more gone in different ways than perhaps at the time. There was I would say that the NIPR probably was held together by the field, personnel research. Ultimately, that was what the Institute, to a large extent, was about. And you had, of course, all the different fields of psychology almost contributing to that. I was really struck by the well-equipped laboratory of Gordon Nelson and Dev Griesel. I mean, my eyes popped out, I might say. And I think that is one of my striking memories. There was always funds for research. And there were these terrific workshops at the CSIR where equipment would be made according to specifications which the researcher would give. They were very, very good. So in general, I think the NIPR offered scope. And it definitely offered scope for me as a fellow. I mean, I worked with Helmut Reuning. I don't really know whether he was my boss, but I think it sort of was definitely the relationship of a senior to a junior. And he invited me to come along, and that was already in the year after I arrived, to come along on one of these expeditions, as they were called, and they'd held together with Witwatersrand University, to map out the psychological abilities and dispositions of the San, the Bushman in the Kalahari Desert. And I think that has been my most striking experience, and has also colored all my further adventures in cross-cultural psychology. That was the starting point. It has been a very, I would say, forming experience. I think that, like many people, coming from that era and coming from a village in the Netherlands, I was pretty much convinced about the big and deep differences between people and so on. And these first people I still remember, women, San women in the Kalahari, and we couldn't speak the same language, but they sort of were so much behaving the same way as you would expect from other people who sort of meet a stranger or something like that. And also in terms of task performance, sort of Helmut Reuning had, together with colleagues, devised all kinds of instruments on concept identification, similarities. I also contributed a little to that. And the structure of thinking, and what was considered to be more similar or less similar. These kind of things were very much alike in these Bushman respondents or testees or participants, as you would find with people in let's say South Africa or Europe.
Having worked at the NIPR, please tell us more about your years.
Well, I think that the NIPR, in my mind, and now I'm limiting the answer to the cross-cultural area. There have been various contributions. I think that basically Simon Biesheuvel has been shaping that field, and the first director of the NIPR. He has been shaping that field very much, also conceptually. I mean, I think that in 1943, the book African Intelligence, which he wrote as a sort of reaction against these the theories which sort of surmised big differences between racial groups in intelligence and whites being better than blacks and that kind of thing. And the arguments which he launched in 1943, very much the same arguments which later on were used against Jensen, for example, in the United States of America. And I think it's almost a historical crying scandal that Biesheuvel's book has never sort of been quoted by people who were engaging in that discussion. It's sort of totally disappeared from the scene, perhaps because it was from South Africa. Maybe also suspicion that something coming from South Africa could not be good, or I don't know what, but it has never sort of reached an international audience, not to the extent that it should. And Biesheuvel then, I think, was of particular significance in his attempts to sort of construct selection tests, selection batteries, which would do justice to capabilities of people who sort of, came to the mines from all kinds of rural areas, even far beyond South Africa. And in my opinion, a lot of ingenuity has gone into that. And these tests actually work pretty well as far as I have been able to gather. And then there's also been the work of Hudson, for example, also work by Helmut Reuning and his associates on the Bushman. For the cross-cultural area, there have been sort of many sort of fairly basic things in perception and elementary processes of cognition, which happened at the time. And to some extent, for me, South Africa is the cradle of cross-cultural psychology. American colleagues will heavily dispute that. But I think that, I've said that already before in a sense, much of that early work is, I don't think, recognized at its proper merits.
What do you remember most clearly about the years at the NIPR? And what role did Dr. Biesheuvel play in your professional career?
Well, I think that in a sense I was influenced by him, but he had left as director of the institute at the time I arrived in 1965, and there was very much a sense that he had been forced to leave, more or less, under for political reasons, and I think he was very much missed. And sort of looking backwards, I think that NIPR, after he left, began to be more inward-looking. One of the things which struck me as sort of rather peculiar was the almost the fear for the annual report for the CSIR and the way it had to be translated into Afrikaans, and all the commas had to be in the right place, and these things, it was a kind of a cramp about it almost. I think that's also reflected to some extent on what people were doing. There was quite a bit of selection work for the CSRR itself, for the Defense Force, etc. And I think that's quite a bit of the energy which went into that was, of course, not going into research. And so, as a research institute, although there had been this tremendous impetus, and that sort of was still there, things were also slowing down in a sense. And I think that the NIPR began to lose its leading edge, as it were, already at that time. But that's retrospectively. I had a very good time there. I had many good opportunities to do the research I liked. I felt inspired by people like Helmut Reuning, and also by Biesheuvel himself. I had Helmut Reuning put me on to what has become known as the Biesheuvel hypothesis, the idea that African people will be more open, more capable in the area of auditory and kinesthetic stimuli and that kind of information processing, where European people would be more inclined towards visual information processing. And of course then there are all these stories about Europeans reading already for centuries. Well, there were many, of course, who did the reading, but there was this tradition, this culture, which you wouldn't find in Africa. And one of the big arguments, everybody was always so surprised about the facility of African people like in Johannesburg who speak 3-4 different languages and also sort of get by in English and Afrikaans and so on. So there must be something to it. And Biesheuvel was a believer in major differences between cultural groups, between cultural populations. And he sort of entertained various hypotheses about it. One of the things which I think also he saw as a distinct possibility was that there would be differences in arousal level or the openness to sort of take in information, etc. I think that some of that has been misrecognized also by current black psychologists in South Africa who see him very much as a representative of, or very much at least, they still see him as a representative of, let's say, the white domination. And I doubt whether that does him justice. He was a very open person. But the kind of theories which he would entertain, of course, were theories of that time. They may have been more advanced than those of others, but they're still bound by knowledge available at the time. And there's definitely one thing: he was a strong believer in racial equality, and that atmosphere was also still hanging around in the NIPR. With many of these English-speaking, somewhat more liberal people trying to pursue that tradition. But there were also sort of limitations on that. I mean, some of the people in the administration were very much inclined to watch pretty meticulously that all kinds of separation rules between black staff members and white staff members were maintained and so on and so forth. In the Congress of the International Association for Applied Psychology in 1971 in Liège in Belgium, Jensen, the famous Jensen on the racial differences between black and white in the United States, he had sort of made a major publication on this in 1969, and he was a main speaker, the first speaker in a symposium which dealt with his work. And he is a very good speaker, and he gave a sort of very strong argument why his position was right. And then there were 3 people, I think 3 or 4 people who were asked to give a commentary. And I've forgotten their names except Simon Biesheuvel. But the first came, there was this consideration and there was that consideration. And, Jensen was probably not right, but etc. And the second person who came to give a comment had a similar story. And then Simon Biesheuvel came on. And he began to hammer Jensen. This was wrong and that was wrong. And he really sort of so strongly argued against anything what Jensen had been saying that he got a roaring applause. And I remember there were some people sitting behind me and said, "Where does this man come from? Where does this man come from?" And then I said, "He comes from South Africa." They didn't want to believe me. So I really think that to think that also his book in 1943 already, this is totally incompatible with sort of a non-forward outlook on racial equality. And again, he was a strong believer that there were important differences between human beings, but not in the sense of superiority or inferiority. That definitely, I have never sort of come across anything like that. But I really think that when it comes to the history of psychology in South Africa, that he probably is the most remarkable person. And also the way he used to conduct meetings and so on, allowing people to their say, etc. While at the same time he could be pretty critical. It was not like being sort of not outspoken, but so he had a firm opinion on many things, very mature opinion I found, but also would allow space for others to put their perspective.
How did the NIPR impact on your belief or your perspective as to the value of psychology as a discipline?
Well, what I considered still to be relevant is some of the earlier work which was initiated here on perception, etc., which was also inspirational to a person I mentioned already before, Jan Derengovsky. He was very much took an earlier lead, I think to some extent even from Hudson and Hudson's pictures and the information gathered in that research and some of the things which were done in the Kalahari Desert by Roining and his colleagues and so on. Again, they're not part of the current literature anymore. They're not referenced. But I think that there is some lasting knowledge which is useful for current students, and that it is much more a matter of cross-cultural psychology, having moved away from perception and being mainly concerned with social aspects. I am rather proud of the fact that I'm the co-author of a textbook together with John Barry and Marshall Siegel and Pierre Dassin. And there is a chapter in perception dealing with this earlier work to a large extent. So for me it is, let's say, I've also sort of consciously tried to keep this alive. I think it's important knowledge.
If you have another 100 years ahead of you, what would you still like to achieve?
I would. I think that I would sort of try to develop a human ethology. I think that psychology, unfortunately, already in the 50s, definitely in the 60s, and later became very much a social science. And then, of course, there's been this enormous revolution, and with the emphasis on to some extent biological, but particularly on neuropsychological, physiological processes, and so on. And the one thing which is sort of very much left aside is a broader biological orientation where you have to look at people like Tinbergen and Lawrence, particularly Tinbergen. The field of ethology and animal ethology has become much more a study of brain processes and very micro-oriented, because they have the technology. And that technology is not available to human researchers. We have to be a bit respectful for our participants, and that means that certain ways of research are not easily available. But to sort of look at patterns in terms of what you can observe on humans, and then try to explain these in the way, from a developmental perspective, from an evolutionary perspective, that kind of research is very much, I think, absent in psychology, also definitely absent in cross-cultural psychology. And I think that deserves much more attention. And perhaps that also will give us some kind of notion about how far explanation in psychology can actually go. One of the surprising things about our science is the small percentage of variance which we usually explain and which we're unhappy with, that we can explain it. We never look at all the variance which we are not able to explain. And I think there must be some reasons for the limits of our explanations. And I think that to explore those further, I'll settle for 50 years, all right?
Where is psychology heading? And are there certain things that you think that one should caution our discipline in terms of where it is heading?
Well, if it comes to cross-cultural psychology, it's sort of infinite search for all kinds of differences. You administer some instrument to group X, or sort of ad hoc sample from group X or country X, and then you go to country Y where you happen to have a colleague and she or he is prepared to administer the same questionnaire. Now, that you won't get easily published anymore, so you have to have 6 or 10 countries and ask some additional questions, and you'll find, lo and behold, you'll find some differences. And it's almost inescapable to find differences. The null hypothesis, which we don't often talk about, is the hypothesis which we want to sort of statistically test, is of course nonsensical in cross-cultural psychology, where your basic expectation is there'll be some difference anyway. I mean, that is what you're after. And to sort of go about that in formulating an expectation of no differences, that doesn't make sense. Then you really must have a design which strongly allows you to come up with no differences, even in the face of all these little bias factors and method artifacts which are going to creep in. So I think that they're if you were a young psychologist, then I think that definitely in cross-cultural psychology there is scope for new developments, novelty. And, just mapping out more differences is not interesting. Look for a developmental perspective, for example. How do these differences come about, or something like that? But that, of course, requires longitudinal approaches, and that's difficult, and people shy away from it, etc.
What do you regard as the most essential characteristics of people who study psychology?
Well, if it comes to research, and then I think you better be extremely smart, and there's a lot of things to find out, and then you will probably become a very good psychologist. When it comes to applied fields, I'm not even so sure. I think there the social orientation, empathy, and that kind of thing is probably important. Although I find one of the worrisome things about psychology, and probably that has become a little less in recent decades, is enormous discrepancy between research and the profession. I think the professionals are now a bit more concerned about the quality of their services, also a bit more suspicious even probably about what effects they have, a bit more inclined to listen to researchers, and I think researchers really have come out of their ivory tower and realized that psychology can only survive as a science if it has practical or applied societal relevance. In that sense, there has been some convergence over recent years.
Where is psychology heading from your point of view? Where do you see psychology going to in the future, and what should psychology be doing in future?
I think that both in predominantly white campuses and predominantly black campuses, there could be more of a vision about what is in political circles called the Rainbow Nation. I mean, I think it's a terrific concept. And, sometimes I've heard white psychologists with the consultant practice argue, these tests which we have imported from the US or wherever they come from, and some, of course, have been re-standardized, etc., but sometimes tests are still used with the more or less original norms, etc. Well, these are the best we have. That I find an unacceptable answer. Then it is our profession's task to get better instruments. So there is this sort of sticking to the tradition, and I think that in some black campuses, and that I find a bit worrisome, with the real poverty almost of earlier education, which is sort of still lingering on in staff members who I think aren't really the best teachers which you could wish for a new generation. The problems of getting things published, you may really think that you're onto something, that you have something important to say, but if you don't sort of put it together in the way the editors of American and European journals see fit, then you're nowhere. So some black psychologists, I think, consciously turn to Nigerian outlets and that kind of thing, which of course is not very helpful. But also the sort of the argument, we are African, we're different, and I've heard that in a few places. That also is not constructing towards this sort of rainbow ID. So these constituencies, they have to work much closer together and to really cooperate much more. And I think that argument goes both ways. I cannot say that I find that there is one particular section or grouping in psychology, as far as I'm aware of this, in South Africa, where you can say, well, these are really creating the largest part of this problem. I think it's very wide, it's very general, and I find that really disappointing. This almost a lack of future vision, which as if the political transition has not sort of translated into persons and what they're doing, but I see too little of that in a scientific perspective, as it were. I think that this psychology and as a behavior science and the social sciences have a very important task in providing evidence against this kind of thing, sort of also in sort of notifying the public at large about these processes and how they play out, and as it were, in that sense, making it more difficult for these other forces in society to develop. What I'd really like to promote is sort of good research in South Africa, and if I sort of can be conducive to that, and sort of share some of my research experiences, etc. I find it sort of rewarding. Sometimes it also scares me a bit. When I was a child, we would bring every Monday a nickel or a dime or whatever, and that would go into to a spaarpot. I don't even know what the English word is, and that was for the mission. And these missionaries nowadays, I think we would say, well, was it such a good idea that they sort of tried to convert people? And it may well be that I am a bit of a missionary about cross-cultural psychology, that in 25, 30 years or whenever, my mission and the ideas I try to promote will also sort of looked at with a great deal of more skepticism than would be pleasant for me. But that's how history develops, I think.